Good morning, everybody. Welcome. This breakout session is titled Using Restorative Approaches to Respond to Gender-Based Violence. Welcome. Thank you for being here. If you have any questions for our presenters, please use the Q&A function here on Zoom. They'll tell you more about that. Also, if you're having any technical difficulties, please email info@mngrc.org. We're going to be putting it in the chat. We're also going to be putting a number that you can text in case you have any technical difficulties. And now I would love to turn it to our amazing presenters for today. Enjoy.
Thanks so much, Paulina. I'm Katie Corna. I'm an assistant professor at St. Cloud State University, and this is my colleague, Michelle Braley, the executive director of Seward Longfellow Restorative Justice. Just as a note, I've got some notes right here, so if I look away, I'm looking at my notes. So I just wanted us to take a moment to ground. So always with the language of invitation, you're invited to put your body in a space that feels more comfortable. Our bodies are disciplined all day. So what shape might your body take if it were not expected to be in any particular shape? It's kind of nice that everybody's cameras are off, so maybe you feel a little more space to do that. So notice what's resting. Maybe it's your back against a chair. Maybe it's your feet on the ground. And then just begin to notice your breath. Notice your breath breathing into that solid, reliable place that's touching a surface. Imagine your own breath moving towards that reliable, consistent, steady place that's holding you. It's holding all the other beings around you. It's holding all the people in this webinar. And imagine that solid, grounded sensation moving throughout other parts of your body. So maybe it's moving down your back. Maybe it's moving up from your feet. So that in your own mind, you can maybe imagine that solid, grounded, reliable energy throughout your whole physical body. And maybe as you breathe, you can even imagine it emanating from you to other beings in your physical space or even in this virtual space. And then take 3 more breaths in your own time. And if you had your eyes closed, you can go ahead and blink them open. Maybe you notice something that could use a little attention, maybe your jaw. I invite you to give those things your attention. So our intention today is to present our interpretation of our findings to an audience of practitioners or interested parties and invite you to be open to thinking about new or surprising things that you learn and how and if you could apply any of the learning to your current context. So our plan for today is to talk about the context and definitions from a study that we recently completed, provide you with an illustration of an example of what we might be talking about, give you a little more information about our study methodology, the results and implications. We'll go through a reflective practice, and then we'll have some discussion and questions at the end. So you're welcome to put questions in the Q&A at any time, and then we'll attend to those at the end of the presentation. So why consider restorative justice for gender-based violence? So the only formal systems that we have to respond to gender-based violence, or GBV, are via the criminal legal system. Less than 1% of experiences of gender-based violence have any criminal legal consequences. The criminal legal system does not prioritize healing, nor acknowledge the experiences of communal harm that often accompany gender-based violence and contribute to an ecosystem of sexism and misogyny. Often victims and survivors report the system causing them further harm, and participants overwhelmingly stated that harm occurs because of white supremacist and patriarchal ideas of gender, which enable harms to women, femme, queer, and trans people. Those harms, which again are rarely reported, are then further perpetuated within a criminal legal context, which reify the same social norms, are arduous, costly, only encompass and capture a minority of gender-based harms and don't prioritize individual or communal healing. Just give you some space in a lot of these slides to read the quotes. So these are quotes from our study.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'll take a minute just to ground us in some definitions. And I know each of these words that I'm going to explain or talk about are definitions. We know we could spend days, weeks unpacking these words. So I hope you'll just indulge me in a very quick definition for each of these, understanding that we have different levels of familiarity. We may be coming at this with more experience in gender-based violence or more experience in restorative justice. Maybe the terms are new, both terms are new. So just to think about what these terms mean that we're going to use quite a bit today. So for restorative justice, our criminal legal system focuses on the law that was broken to decide what punishment is deserved. Restorative justice considers the harm that occurred, which may or may not be a law that was broken. And restorative justice considers what needs to happen to make things better. The criminal legal system generally focuses its attention on one person as the person harmed and one person as the person who did the harm. While the restorative framework holds central the harm to an individual, that is a survivor, it also makes space for consideration of harm to the community, to the family, and even to the harm doer. Our contemporary restorative movement has been deeply influenced by indigenous and ancestral traditions and knowledge around the world. And so we owe a debt of gratitude to those traditions that I also think really are, again, we're not doing something new. We are bringing back very old wisdom that I really feel is actually at the core and central to all of us when we tap into sort of our best selves. We also recognize the influence of faith communities that have really looked at how are we in right relationship with people? What does it mean to reconcile is a theme in many faith traditions. Prison abolition, all of our examinations now about is the prison system serving us? Do we need to dismantle that system? Are really influencing the contemporary restorative justice movement, and certainly alternative dispute resolution or mediation has influenced our contemporary movement. Transformative justice is a much newer term, and I would suggest we are still coming to an agreement on its interpretation. Broadly, as I understand it, the aim of transformative justice is to change the conditions that led to the harm so that it doesn't happen again. Those systemic issues that are contributing to perpetuating harm. Today, we'll primarily be using the term restorative justice, although certainly individual instances of restorative justice do lead to systemic change. And of course, within a restorative justice process, we need to be aware of the systems that contributed to the harm, such as sexism and misogyny, or we will perpetuate that harm. For gender-based violence, the Center for Disease Control estimates that up to 90% of women, femme, queer, and trans people will experience gender-based violence at some point in their lives. Increasingly, practitioners working in gender-based violence recognize the limitations of operating in the criminal legal system, a system rooted in sexism and white supremacy, which fundamentally is not designed for healing or justice. As well, the Black Lives Matter movement, movements for prison abolition, and the murder of George Floyd in 2020 have amplified the harms of the criminal legal system within public consciousness, providing further support for the importance of this study. But I would say most importantly, many people who have been harmed by gender-based violence are seeking and looking to better ways to respond, different ways to respond to what has happened to them, to what they've experienced, than our current criminal legal system. In my role at Seward-Longfellow Restorative Justice, Seward and Longfellow are two neighborhoods in South Minneapolis. I became interested in this application of restorative justice to gender-based violence because our program was receiving an increasing number of requests from people wanting a restorative response, a restorative process in response to gender-based violence. And because I'd been troubled at times in hearing the way restorative justice is being defined, and in thinking that we may not be doing enough to consider sexism and misogyny and everything that perpetuates gender-based violence when we are trying to use a restorative justice process. And I think, a caution is just that people that may feel very experienced and familiar with restorative justice, I just feel we need to take great care in moving to use those experiences and knowledge and skills in gender-based violence, because gender-based violence is perpetuated within a system, and that without this constant care and vigilance, we will perpetuate that within our restorative process as well. So I'll give an example, and I'll be staying intentionally vague to protect confidentiality. But a call that I received now several years ago was from an adult leader of a youth group. The group had gone on an overnight retreat together. After the retreat, a 16-year-old girl in the group reported to an adult that a male peer and a longtime friend of hers had kissed her without consent. The girl said she wanted to talk to the boy about what happened. The youth leader called to ask my assistance for restorative justice process. The adult said that they wanted to move quickly, as the girl was going to be leaving to do some study abroad. The adult told me that they didn't think we needed to include anyone beyond the two parties in this restorative process. She said she didn't see a reason for others at the organization, other adults, to know about what happened. What she was looking for was someone to do that process and to do it quickly. What is it like to hear this story? Are there feelings or sensations associated with that? Are there questions? Are you having reactions to this call? What might you have been thinking had you received this phone call and this request? One of the things that came up for me, I think probably you share my deep concern in the way this was presented to me and in the request. Things that are coming to mind for me as I'm hearing from this person are the age of the people involved. Is the youth able to make a decision about this path forward? Are there implications? I'm a social worker. I'm a mandated reporter. Are there any things I need to do? Whether I agree or disagree with sort of mandated reporting, I am within that requirement. So I need to consider that. I'm thinking about an adult who's controlling the process and the outcome instead of the person harmed. I'm listening to behaviors that perpetuate gender-based violence. And that's the secrecy that I'm hearing, that no one else in the organization needs to know. And there was minimizing of what had occurred. Well, these are friends, it's just a kiss, which again are the same behaviors that perpetuate gender-based violence in our society. I heard reputation maintenance. That is the concern for the youth, or is the organization more concerned with protecting themselves? What's the motivation for this call to my program? I heard them conceptualizing this as an individual harm and not the community harm that occurred. How does this harm other youth, or I'm going to say children, if you were at the earlier session where Malika encouraged us? These are children. How were other children, other youth at the program impacted? Certainly other kids must know what has happened. We know people talk, others may have been in the room. So to think that only these two youth are impacted really discounts the community impact. Are other kids now feeling afraid? Are other kids feeling like adults weren't keeping them safe? What's going on for them, and how does repair need to happen for them? And it's shirking that community responsibility to make things better. What do the adults need to know and learn about their program? What do adults need to learn about the way their program was run, or the guidelines, or conversations about consent, all those things? If we keep it between these two teenagers, we have overlooked the really what I'd call the third leg of the restorative justice stool, which is community. So in short, I said no. I said I would not do a quick process. And I did refer the caller to someone with availability to take the time that was needed. And I raised all of these questions with the caller in terms of that secrecy, just posing some questions about the approach that was being taken. So our hope is that this example illustrates why we cannot just take what we know about restorative justice and gender-based violence and think we're ready to put them together. As you all know, gender-based violence happens in a context of a culture that supports and perpetuates it. If we aren't vigilant about that context, we will perpetuate it, even within restorative justice. I'll turn now to Katie, who's going to talk to you about the study and the research that we did together.
Thanks, Michelle. So as Michelle mentioned, the impetus for this study was that Michelle's program and a lot of other restorative justice and gender-based violence were getting increased inquiries. And a number of practitioners had coalesced over like a previous year and a half just to start to talk about how they could work together to seek some alternative processes, because this is what folks were asking for. So people in the community were asking for this, practitioners were coalescing together, not necessarily knowing steps to move forward. And I was actually relatively new to the Twin Cities, had moved here to do some further training in adolescent medicine, and was a new neighbor to Michelle and to Seward Longfellow Restorative Justice. And so folks were getting a lot more inquiries, and I had connected with Michelle as a new neighbor and as somebody who also had recently found out about a community-based grant that could possibly fund some of the work to be able to explore further what practitioners felt like they needed, what they felt like was working well, how we could center Black, Indigenous, and folks of color and queer and trans communities in all of our orientation to this work and what that would look like. And then what folks really wanted from the research specifically, but also afterwards, right? We recognize that this is going to be a longer process and that it requires a lot of collaboration and meaningful relationships. And so we started with the context of being in the Twin Cities, recognizing that we wanted to think about Minnesota as a whole, but that we were based in the Twin Cities. And so that's where we were thinking about our initial sample. And so our sample was folks who are working within the community in culturally specific organizations. And so in restorative justice organizations, and also in organizations that work with folks with gender-based violence, and then some that there's overlap there. So we specifically were, so this is qualitative research. And so we weren't interested in having a massive sample of people. We're not intending to generalize this, but we were also interested in getting folks who worked in diversity of different spaces. So folks who worked with the Indigenous communities, with older adults, with Somali community, Latinx populations, queer and trans people, folks who were working in higher ed. And then again, there was this group of practitioners that had already coalesced that were beginning to talk about this. So folks from that group, but then also some snowball sampling of like, hey, do you know some other people who might be interested in some of this work? So that's called purposive sampling. We collected data through focus groups and individual interviews. And then we did a thematic analysis to sort of better understand what are the themes that are coming out. Our philosophical approach was critical and intersectional, and it's community-based participatory action research, which is that it's community, it's driven by the community. Community is involved in whatever meaningful way they want to be throughout the process. And we are intending for this to be action oriented. So we're not just getting information and being like, thank you so much. We're intending to get information that is directly applicable and useful to folks who are working in the world. So some of the questions that we asked participants in those focus groups and interviews are on the screen. And for us, centering Black, Indigenous, people of color, and queer folks and trans folks means shifting power, control, and well-being and comfort towards Black, Indigenous, people of color, and queer and trans people. And we also recognize that that is not a monolithic group. So just naming that. These questions sometimes included some prompts. So for example, we might ask at the level of the individual, what is working, and so on. Next slide. So our summary of results that we're going to go into detail a little bit more, but the path that people are taking to get to restorative justice. So currently it's post-conviction. Folks are seeking validation and healing, not wanting to engage the criminal legal system, and their needs change over time. What's working at the intersection of restorative justice and gender-based violence is skilled practitioners, processes being in and of communities that are affected. That restorative justice explicitly centers a victim survivor, and that restorative justice enables engagement. What is not working at the intersection of restorative justice and gender-based violence is funding constraints, both not enough funding and not flexible funding. Historical harm by white practitioners resulting in limited and or strained relationships within the spaces of restorative justice. What practitioners need to make it work better is genuinely, meaningfully centering queer and trans people and Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the work, and more flexible funding. How do we center queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, and people of color? So repair the previous harm, prioritize relationship building and meaningful co-creation, mitigate barriers to participation, meaningfully value Indigenous knowledge. And what our participants hoped for this research is support, collaboration, continued connection, and ultimately systemic change. I'll turn it back over to Michelle.
So as Katie mentioned, the primary method for our research was focus groups. And we sat with people who do this work and asked and listened and talked for hours, always running out of time at each focus group. But because it was the voices of participants, because it was this direct knowledge from them, that it formed the basis of our research, we want to just focus on what they told us directly. And so we're going to go through some slides here now that are quotes of what we heard, and we'll give a little more background on those. I will note that you do have a resource file for our presentation, and in that file will be these slides that include a resource list at the end, but also the summary report, so just a 5-page summary, and then a much longer research paper, thanks to Dr. Querna, that will give you a lot of, the bibliography and all of that to do your own further research, but you can dive much, much deeper into the topic with those resources. So participants talked about the importance of communities that are affected by the harm being involved in designing and driving the restorative process, but also in taking appropriate responsibility for the harm. So again, a restorative process community also takes that responsibility and strives to work to make things better. So with each slide, I'll give you time to read the quote. I'll make a few comments and just ask you to think about what learnings, affirmations, challenges are you hearing to your own experiences as you hear what participants told us. Participants noted that the victim-centered orientation of restorative justice is critical, including sustained support, accountability, and repair for and from community. I'm hoping that this is starting to feel obvious to all of us, that we need to ask survivors what they want. Unfortunately, this type of approach isn't commonplace yet. I work with organizations where if you report sexual harassment, the first thing that happens is it goes to a committee, and a committee researches it and decides, investigates and decides. It's a retributive approach. It's not victim-centered. So there was a book that just came out in March titled Truth and Repair: How Trauma Survivors Envision Justice. The book is by the well-respected researcher on trauma and domestic violence, Dr. Judith Herman. In the book, the author, Dr. Herman, argues that the first step toward a better form of justice is simply to ask survivors what would make things as right as possible for them. While I've been reading the book, I'm getting a lot out of it. I have respect for the work of Dr. Herman. I'm just noting that we've come so accustomed to the retributive or punishment mindset that we need a 275-page book that tells us, ask the survivor what they want. So what does not work at this intersection of restorative justice and gender-based violence is when RJ is a tool rather than understanding it in a historical, cultural, and philosophical context that it belongs to. It's not a cookie cutter approach to justice. It's a dynamic and fluid process that is shaped by the participants in the process. Participants said it was important to approach the work through a justice-focused lens, and that not doing so could perpetuate inequities. Again, restorative justice alone, just being in a restorative process, will not address racism, sexism, homophobia, unless we do the work through that lens and stay vigilant to how we might be perpetuating those systemic harms within a restorative process. Participants also noted that the criminal legal system, as an extension of the larger punitive US social and political norms, takes an unempathic binary view of harm and healing, where one person is harmed and the other must be punished with limited or no support and resources for healing. Funding. Funding was a big topic of conversation. Participants said they needed more consistent, flexible funding that was not tied to traditional, that is patriarchal and white supremacist, notions of knowledge, evidence, and effectiveness that limited their capacity for creativity and responsiveness to community needs and context. Specifically, participants said that current funding did not allow them to work with offenders or those who did the harm. So those of you that might be funded through VAWA, the Victim and Witness Act, or through the Federal Department of Justice funding, there's actually limitations that advocates, that funding is for work with survivors. Until we change those parameters, those advocates can't respond to requests to involve the person who did harm in any sort of repair or process. They are required to engage in prevention work and required them to assess and report on outcomes that are aligned with the funding, but misaligned with their organization's mission and not intended to repair individual and communal harm. I know the way I experience that is this big emphasis from funders on recidivism. And we just know that in repair and restoration and in making things better, there are greater outcomes, more important outcomes to the people involved. And we're often limited to just that one parameter that people want to know. And then there's no current consistent measure of community impact. Current measures only address individual harm without attending to communal harm, which is a foundational principle of restorative justice. Current systems are also limited in the community knowing about or be involved in a process, which leads to then repeated harm to the community.
Participants said that centering the lives and identities of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as well as queer and trans folks, are vital. That imperative can be better met by their often largely white heteronormative organizations by building more relationships with Black, Indigenous, and people of color, exploring why they don't have previous existing meaningful relationships with Black, Indigenous, and other folks of color, and also with queer and trans communities. Some participants noted additional barriers to using restorative justice in gender-based violence. For example, in the current political context, not having legal immigration status is a barrier. Also, if folks aren't familiar with restorative approaches through their culture or country of origin, it can be difficult to understand or uncomfortable to participate in restorative processes. A lot of this work is already happening out of necessity or out of cultural traditions that honor a restorative approach. As well, we mentioned previously, we need to make sure to not continue to just recognize or fund the programs that are established within existing formal structures. And then next slide, Michelle. So what practitioners need to make it work better? Acknowledge and repair harm and change the conditions that led to harm so that further harm is not done. Participants noted that it's critical to acknowledge and repair harm that has occurred as a result of white supremacy and patriarchal norms within justice-centered organizations. They also said that moving forward, it's important that organizations don't perpetuate further harm, which requires changing the conditions that led to the harm and implementing practices which cultivate a just, kind, critically conscious environment. Participants also named that building trust to facilitate equity-focused, productive collaboration is vital. Next slide. Practitioners also need more funding generally and more flexible funding. Participants said they needed funding that's not tied to a traditional, patriarchal, white supremacist, hierarchical understandings of knowledge and what is valued, and evidence and effectiveness. Again, often overvaluing things like recidivism. For example, the state of Minnesota funding often equates effectiveness with reduced recidivism rates. But this isn't the only goal of restorative justice. State and federal funding can also limit who the client can be. That is, programs are not allowed to work with the person who did harm if they receive funding to work with those harmed. That is, victim survivors, as Michelle said earlier. Next slide, Michelle. Often, to access funding, folks need to be doing, quote, evidence-based work, and there's scant evidence for restorative justice models to gender-based violence, especially not in the US. And there's no agreed upon best practice in implementing restorative approaches to gender-based violence. Also, even if there was, things are very culture and context specific. So even using that evidence-based model, if it did exist, is inappropriate to actually really get at what effective programming would look like in any particular context. Also, there is very little research into community change and community anti-violence, anti-sexism interventions. thus understanding and having a consistent, quote, best practice for community change and healing, an imperative part of restorative processes, is really difficult. Next slide.
Technical difficulty.
That's okay.
It's not moving to the next slide. Do you want to just, are you able
Okay.
to talk?
So what participants hoped for from this research was systems level change. The interviews and focus groups ended with asking participants what their hopes were. Well, there you go. Previous one. And with asking participants what their hopes were for this research, most named that they felt like talking with like-minded people who had maybe had similar experiences or ideas about restorative justice and gender-based violence was really important. As well, they felt like larger systems change was necessary and saw this study as hopefully a part of compelling some of that change. Next slide. Participants also expressed hope for continued support for one another in the form of consultation, learning, emotional and professional solidarity. So take a big breath after hearing some of those results and reading those really profound quotes. How is your mind reacting to hearing those? Are there any thoughts you're having? How's your body reacting? Are you noticing any sensations? Where are those sensations? Do they have a tone, a texture? Is there any temperature associated with them? Are they malleable or stable? Are you noticing any new thoughts? I'm just noticing. You might be reflecting on how some of those results could apply to your context. Yeah, Michelle, go ahead to the next slide.
Thank you, Katie. So we'll just wrap up in the next 10 minutes or so before your questions. So please put any questions in the Q&A. But of course, with our research, there's limitations. While it was not intended to be generalizable, and we did work very hard to have a diverse group of participants in a lot of different identities of diversity. Given the indigenous roots of restorative practices, further research could benefit from hearing additional and diverse indigenous voices. While we combined a question about centering the experiences of Black, Indigenous, people of color, and queer and trans folks, each of these identities and intersectional identities needs individual attention. And then we did have to move to focus groups on Zoom. But strengths included that it was designed the focus group design created an opportunity for participants to learn from and challenge each other. And many of the participants told us about their personal experiences with gender-based violence, which informed their perspectives. And we know, given the statistic we cited of 90% of women and femme and trans folks experiencing gender-based violence, and we know that male-identified masculine folks experience gender-based violence as well, that we do not have to target victim survivors to get their voices because we are everywhere. And so those voices were present in our focus group as well. Practice implications. These are some, of course, but not all, and I hope you'll take your own today. These implications are general and can be thought of as, what do we do next? This is where we can begin to imagine how these results may inform our work. For example, some advocates told us they were thinking about the ways their work may have caused harm, as advocacy work over the past few decades has largely meant advocating within the criminal legal system, and advocates have really worked to strengthen that system, moving us to a place where there's going to be somebody arrested when the police are called. And those are some things that advocates within our focus groups are saying, maybe there's repair we need to do because we have helped to create and strengthen this system that is harming people. For me, the study reinforced a belief that the most effective way to approach the work is to co-create restorative processes, pairing those with experience in restorative justice with people more experienced in gender-based violence. We need to begin asking survivors what they want and then work with them to get to those needs met, instead of a more traditional menu of services. Well, these are the 3 or 4 options at our agency. These are the 3 or 4 options if you talk with me. Ask them what they want, and then we work with them to create the pathway forward that's most meaningful to them. It also means honoring the requests of survivors who want to pursue a retributive response, and then working within that system to see how survivors can get their needs met. Policy implications. Certainly, we heard so much about funding. Participants were clear that their organizations needed increased funding generally to provide the most opportunities for prevention and compassionate victim survivor-centered responses. It's crucial to have more flexible sources of funding so that service providers can offer the most responsive services for their needs. So both more funding and then funding that's more flexible. We also need to work within the legal system that exists. For now, it is the system we have. There's much we can do and must do so that if a victim survivor has contact with anyone within that system, they're met with an intersectional understanding of their context that centers their needs and wishes. We can work within the current legal system to expand opportunities for diversion to restorative justice programs. Too often we hear from those within and outside the system that as we expand options for RJ, it can be that we are considering RJ for anything but gender-based violence. I've been in many spaces where that's the conversation, as we're increasing programs, expanding programs, working with the city attorney, the county attorney, we get to this point that says, this is for anything but gender-based violence. We need to examine those imposed limits. Why are we so hesitant? What are the fears? What are the concerns? As Katie mentioned, one thing that folks wanted out of the focus groups was to stay connected. They found a lot of meaning just in finding people that were grappling with these similar issues. And so we've created a working group. We've been meeting for about 3 years now. We meet from May through September. We're building a network of folks across Minnesota. We do meet on Zoom, which means sometimes we represent 15 counties with the programs attending. We're educating ourselves about what's happening in restorative justice and gender-based violence around the state. We're encouraging, supporting, and inspiring each other. Because we've been meeting for many years, any of you familiar with group work, we do ask you to contact Katie or I for a very short introduction to the group, of which this presentation has been most of it, but wanting to just touch base, and then we'd be happy to add you to our invite list for that monthly discussion.
So as we move towards integrating this new learning, or what may be new learning for you, into what you already know, we want to just allow ourselves to ground one more time, and then we're going to move towards the Q&A. So knowing that these are big things, big ideas, maybe there's some big feelings around them, they don't need to be figured out or solved, they just get to exist. And how do we practice sort of in the face of these big things so that we can sustain ourselves for this longer road ahead. So again, just one more practice, always with the language of invitation, can choose to join us or not. Just invite you to put your body again in a comfortable shape. Maybe you need to shift around to do that. Feel whatever is touching the surface. Maybe it's the same thing you noticed in our opening practice. Maybe it's something different. And notice that support that's stable, reliable, unshifting. And then begin to turn your attention towards your breath. Also stable, reliable, here for you. And breathe from that space of support. See if you can imagine that stability, that reliability, moving from that place that is holding you to other parts of your body. Maybe even imagine it radiating to other beings in this virtual space or in your physical space. Maybe you can imagine other very grounded beings in your physical space, giving some of that stable, reliable energy back to you. And then take 3 more big breaths in your own time. If you had your eyes closed, you begin to blink your eyes open. Maybe stretch out your toes, your fingers. Notice anything that could use a little tenderness. Offer that thing, that tenderness. And then just to sum us up before we move towards the Q&A. The legal system and funding constraints are often the driver in determining our response to gender-based violence, instead of practitioners and victim survivors determining their own path forward. It's the hope of the authors of this report that this contributes in a small way to creating meaningful and accessible restorative responses to gender-based violence for victim survivors who desire it. We hope that this report and our presentation and our continued work and the growing literature and collaboration around this vital area of social justice and public health continue to inspire future research, practice, policy, and meaningful relationships.
So as we move into our discussion, which I do hope if any questions are coming, I see one and I'll answer that shortly, but please put any comments in. It's the one way we can kind of come together and hear your ideas as well. If you have a comment, we'd like to hear that. So is there anything we've discussed that was surprising to you? And really, where do you see this being useful for your own work? Have we shared or have you heard something that might influence the way you're working or the way your agency is working? What are the thoughts or questions you have? We'd just love to hear. I know it's harder on this Zoom platform to all kind of connect. I'm sorry we couldn't see you and be all introduced to each other, but please, if you have a question or comment, we'd appreciate hearing it. One question is, how were participants compensated? And I was thinking, as we talked about funding, and Katie mentioned that we got a research grant. I will say the research grant was $5,000. So I think that people understand the limitations of that as well. Katie worked on the research paper for a year. So I realized even in that kind of saying, well, this was funded, we need to be cautious about that because it was funded at a very, very minimal level. And we definitely wanted to recognize the time and expertise of the participants. Also recognizing, because of the pool that we drew from, the people that were participating were generally, this was their work, this was their job, they were in paid capacities. So I take some, it's nice to know they were already at work doing and learning things that were furthering their work. And everyone was given a gift card Katie, I don't remember, were they $25 or $50 gift cards?
They were $50. Yeah. And I forget to mention this because sometimes that it's so important to ask that. And sometimes people, so just so, yeah, sometimes, so I got $0 for doing this, and I actually don't have any publications from this. And that's just exists. That's totally fine. That's not what's important to me. And I recognize that I sit in this tradition of people who have been really harmful in doing research with folks. And so I'll just name that what I've gotten out of this is really awesome relationships and feeling like I'm doing something that feels meaningful and applied. That is often in direct conflict with the imperatives of higher education institutions who want to pump out more empirical research, which makes a lot of sense. And clearly empirical research is really important. And it comes at the cost of having more meaningful relationships and doing work that's like really community driven and community based. That takes time.
Another question is, where are we seeing this work being done across Minnesota? I mentioned in the working group that meets every month, sometimes we're representing as many as 15 counties. That's not because there might be 15 people from 15 different counties. It's because some of our smaller counties in Minnesota, people may be working in a tri-county area, or they cover 5 counties, and they're coming into the space to have conversation. The person who asked that, you'd be very welcome to email me directly, because while I try not to be kind of Twin Cities centric, sometimes I do have, and I'm a lifelong Minnesotan, I can still have trouble on the geography of our kind of whole state. But I know we've got folks from Rochester, we've got folks from Duluth, we've got folks from Southwest Minnesota attending, we've got folks closer to like the Fargo-Moorhead area, Moorhead attending. So we're beginning to cover, we're getting Cook County, northern Minnesota. So we're really seeing this interest across our state. And what's encouraging as well is some of that work is actually happening. We're getting probation officers, we're getting people within the legal system, in addition to mostly people with, I would say most of the group is people, advocates within gender-based violence who are seeking this space. If you'd like more information, I could be more specific, but if I could look at notes later.
Michelle, also, it may be relevant to bring into some of the recent legislation that has passed around restorative justice across the state.
Well, people may be aware, we passed, I say we, I was on a committee for 2 years, maybe some of you were as well, but passed legislation to establish an office of restorative practices at the state level. It's going to be focused on younger people, with the idea that across our 87 counties in Minnesota, all youth who are cited would have equal opportunity, would have restorative options available to them. There's going to be funding with that office. So those of you involved in youth work, especially as you're across Minnesota, you may want to follow that and see when the request for proposals comes out. The legislation that's needed in our state is legislation that will protect the restorative process from being subpoenaed into that legal process. And so there are states that have passed that protection. So you're all familiar, many of you may be attorneys, attorney-client privilege, right? So the thing that your client says to you in that private conversation, you are not required to say in court. That is a private conversation with you and your client. Practitioners of restorative justice, we don't have that same protection. So if I were to sit in a circle with a survivor, with the person who harmed them, we go into some deep work, and for some reason the survivor decides, or maybe the person who did the harm, anyway, there's a decision that this process is ending, and somebody says, no, we're taking this to court. It goes into the court process. I don't have any protection, or really I shouldn't say the parties involved don't have any protection that the things they said to me that I won't be required to bring those into court. if I were to be subpoenaed. So Illinois has done some statewide work. They passed legislation within the last couple of years. And what's really encouraging about their legislation is that it says that any restorative process is protected. That means when the teacher pulls the students out and has a restorative conversation, that's protected. So any restorative process is protected. Vermont, I'm learning, has just passed legislation. So that is the next step, a very important next step in Minnesota for to grow this, because at this point, any person working with an attorney or anybody that checks with an attorney to say, should I move forward? I've been invited into this restorative process. Very likely they would be encouraged not to do it, discouraged from doing it. And I guess I should even back up and say, you know, as we compare the restorative and the retributive, we know that in a retributive process, the more you admit, the more you say you did, the harsher your punishment is going to be. Where in restorative justice, we really approach it to say, tell us everything. We will work with you to make it better. And so these systems are in conflict. And if people are concerned that the things they say may harm them later, they're going to hesitate within our restorative process. So for the policy legal people out there, just know that there's conversations happening across the state, but that to me is our next most important legislation if we're actually going to grow the use of restorative justice and gender-based violence. It looks like we're at the end of our questions and really close to the end of our time, where I know our focus on people taking care of themselves is that you get another minute to stretch before we go into another session. I know I'll be at PICA this evening and hope some of you are able to join for the in-person session. If you go to the slides, thanking our research people, if you go to the slides that are in your resource packet, you'll see this slide with our contact information. You'll see some resources, videos, articles, organizations. And as Katie mentioned, or as we mentioned, the longer research paper will have much longer than bibliography of all kinds of articles you can read. We thank you very much for your time and attention today. We hope to continue in dialogue with you. We'd love to see some of you with interest to join us in our work group so that when survivors come to us, when a person harmed says, I want a restorative pathway, we can confidently say, yes, these are the resources. This is the path forward for you. Thank you again. And now I will invite Paulina, who's been our background host today, Paulina, to join us to close us out.